Chris Paul reportedly out at least 1 week for the Phoenix Suns. On today's episode of Locked On Suns, what do they lose in this particular series with the point guard on the bench, and what do they do to replace him? Let's go.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We are back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and I'm your host, Brendon Kleen, a credentialed media member covering the Suns for the past 6 seasons, a writer at Suns.com, and the host of the Just Basketball Show wherever you get your podcast. Thanks for making Locked On Suns your first listen each and every day to start off your Tuesday, Wednesday, whenever you are listening to this. I know we have people all over the world. We're available free on all podcast platforms, so hit follow or subscribe wherever you're finding us. If you have not already, get the show in your feed every single day. Become an everydayer. Today's show, guys, is brought to you by eBay Motors. Championship team is about each player being a perfect fit. Same with your vehicle. So for parts that fit, head to eBay Motors. Look for the green check. Stay in the game with eBay Guaranteed Fit at ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. All right, Chris Paul. Just before I was already about to hit record, Shams Charania reported the Suns are expecting to be without Chris Paul for games 3 through 5. He will be officially reevaluated in 1 week. The Suns have not released anything out as of 4:45 Phoenix time as I am recording this show. If an email pops up in my inbox as I'm recording, I will definitely include that here in the analysis. But I want to talk about first, what do they lose with Chris Paul out? All right. And in this particular playoffs, in this particular season, and even in this particular series, you know what they lose with Chris Paul, period. I don't have to tell you that. He's a guy who's earned the nickname Point God, right? He's been in the playoffs every single year of his career for the most part. This is not hard to understand what they're losing, but he had an up and down season. He is definitely not the focal point of this team anymore. And so what are they really missing? What do they really need to replace? One interesting thing from a stat standpoint right off the bat is Chris Paul in these playoffs so far has been actually the number one on-off player for the Suns, meaning when Chris Paul is on the court versus when he's off, the difference between how the Suns perform in each of those situations is the greatest among any player. Now, some context goes into that, but it also is context that's relevant here. Devin Booker and Kevin Durant have been playing a ton, so they're going to be playing when things go badly, when things go well, with these guys, with that guy, everything. They're going to get all of the statistical noise of that. Chris Paul is going to be in there specific times because he's only playing 35, 40 minutes instead of 40, 45. And most importantly, the backups that are on the court in place of Chris Paul have been really inconsistent and lackluster. I think we all can say that. Obviously, what that means is, as I'm about to talk about in terms of who replaces him, not the best news. Right? That means that the guys who have been bringing the Suns down and being such a negative that when Chris Paul's not on the court, things fall apart, well, those guys are now going to be starting, playing heavier roles, etc. Not ideal. We'll get to that in depth in a second, but that's the main thing they lose, is just an anchor for their team, somebody who, when he steps on the court, has been a big boost. Number 2 is generating threes for the role players and for Booker and Durant, but especially as we've talked so much about threes throughout the whole playoffs. We've talked about guys like Lee and Shamet and anyone else, Craig Okogie, not getting threes up or not making them, whatever the case may be. That, a lot of it is driven by Chris Paul, with one notable exception, and I'm going to dive more into the offense through 2 games and through last night's game and what it can change into, but Booker has done that a little bit, which is what I'll get to. Chris Paul's the main guy. And then layups and dunks for DeAndre Ayton and the roller, right? The pick and roll man, whoever that is. Most of the time it's DA, but obviously Biyombo and Landale are in there at times as well. And then lastly, really the role that Chris Paul's been playing when Booker or Durant have the ball in their hands is also pretty valuable, something that is going to need to be replaced, which is spot-up shooting and a secondary scoring threat. You know, in this series, Chris Paul has not let it fly in those spot-up situations quite as much as he did against the Clippers in the first round or as he did in the regular season after the Durant trade, but he's still a threat to do that. And even if it's not a pure spot-up shot, there's been a lot of times in the best moments of this Suns offense when the ball has been in Booker's hands, even if Chris Paul's not taking a three when he catches the ball, he's often attacking a closeout, getting into the mid-range, and still making that signature mid-range pull-up jumper just in a different way than we're used to seeing him. That is also going to be gone. So those are the things you need to replace. Those are not small. Let's talk about who starts. And I'll probably have a guest or two on the rest of the week. Definitely Aaron for Thursday's show. So we'll continue to talk about this. But my first instinct, my first reaction, diving into the data, I want to talk through. All right. So let's again go into some of those numbers from a lineup standpoint. In the regular season, the Payne, Booker, Okogie, Durant, Ayton lineup, which in theory is the most logical place to go for a replacement starting lineup, right? That lineup played 10 possessions together, which sounds like it wasn't a lot. It wasn't, but all things considered, not a lot of the Durant-centered lineups had much chemistry or time together, right? So 10 possessions in all the grand scheme of things with Durant, pretty high, as crazy as that might sound. And they were a plus 60 points per 100 possessions, if you extrapolate that out. In the playoffs so far, Payne has barely played, so not a lot of Payne data, not much of any, and if it was in there at all, it's ugly because he played in game 2 and it was really bad. So instead, we have the Shamet in place of Paul, and then either Craig or Okogie at the 3, and then Book, Durant, and Ayton, right? Those are the 5-man lineups that we've seen minus Paul for the most part in the playoffs. The Shamet, Craig, and then those 3 stars, 20 possessions plus 30. Very good. The Okogie version, only 12 possessions and a 0. And honestly, a 0 is not terrible in the grand scheme of things, just because, again, 12 possessions is not a lot, and there's a lot of lineups that are big negatives. So staying afloat isn't the worst thing. If you could play the Nuggets to a draw and then let a game go into fourth quarter and you just roll the dice with Durant and Booker, that's not terrible, right? So even a neutral, even a 0 in the plus minus from a points per 100 possession standpoint is not the worst thing. So with that all in mind, with what they need in mind, I actually would not start Cam Payne. And maybe I'm colored a little bit by what we saw in game 2. I'm more than happy to admit that. It did get very ugly. I told everybody that would listen from the start of this series, the everydayers heard me yelling about it all week, that I did not think that the Suns, that this was a series for Payne, right? That the Nuggets, is what I meant to say, offered him very many places to be impactful, because guarding Murray, not a good role for him. Some of the backup ball handlers and wings that are out there for the Nuggets, they don't even play 10 guys right now, so it's really only 8, and both of the Browns, Bruce and Christian Brown, are bigger than Payne. So I didn't really see something where I felt great about throwing him out there, unless you were going to say, all right, go stand in the corner and be on MPJ and dare him to shoot. Okay, I guess, maybe that's what the Suns would do. KCP, I suppose, is somebody that you could put Payne on, although he went off last night. And Payne was out there. Payne got shot over the top of on a couple of those KCP threes. So I would not start Cameron Payne. I would start Damian Lee. All right. So none of the data I gave you had Damian Lee in it, but I thought that he was the most aggressive and impacted the game in the most ways in game 2, as well as over the course of the season. I think that Landry Shamet is a better team defender, a better one-on-one defender. I don't think that Damian Lee's a bad team defender, but look, I do think that, Michael Porter Jr., Aaron Gordon, those guys will hunt whoever's out there. Lee, Shamet, Payne, whatever. Chris Paul even, right? If he was still playing. So you're always going to have to worry about that. But Damian Lee is going to take threes when they're open. He's going to move the ball smartly, and he is going to offensive rebound like he did in game 2, potentially. He is going to push the pace, all that stuff. So he's good in transition. That's what I would do. So I would go with Book, Leah, Kogi, Durant, Ayton in the starting lineup, and then Craig, Payne, Landale off the bench. So you still play Campaign, you just don't start him. And I do like Landale. We'll talk about that as the week goes along as well. But that's where I'm at half an hour after seeing Shams Charania's report. Let's talk about the offense. David Nash used to write the 4-Point Play newsletter, great follow on Twitter, broke down each ball handler, star ball handler on the Suns, and 3 different categories of offense and how each has performed. And there's a lot to learn, especially now that we know Chris Paul is not going to be playing the rest of the potentially series, if not at least the next 3 games. We'll talk about that next. First, today's show, guys, brought to you by BetterHelp. Look, everybody has their own thing. Everybody has something that's changed, something that causes them stress, something that just occupies their mind. It's so easy to get caught up in what everyone else needs from you, and maybe you don't often take a moment to think about what you need from yourself. But when we spend all of our time giving, it can leave us feeling stretched, thin, or burned out. Therapy can give you the tools to find more balance in your life so you can keep supporting others without leaving yourself behind. BetterHelp is there. BetterHelp can be that. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Find more balance with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. Coming back here, we're talking offense, which was the issue in both games. 107-point total in Game 1, 87-point total in Game 2. That is not the Suns we know. That is not going to be good enough. The Suns have only had 2 30-point quarters in this entire series out of 8. All right, so we're just going to focus on Game 2 here. Again, David Nash used to write the 4-Point Play newsletter, used to host the 7 Seconds or Less podcast. Still tweeting and providing really good analysis, so shouts out to David. Go follow him at the IV Point Play if you have not already. He broke down Game 2 by 3 types of offense and how it fared for Paul, Booker, and Durant. All right, so the 3 types of offense were middle pick and roll, empty side pick and roll, and isolations. Now, with Chris Paul, there were no isolations. And with Kevin Durant, for instance, very few empty side pick and rolls. But let me give you the highlights. The empty pick and roll, which I think the reason it's called empty is the strong side corner is empty. The side of the floor is empty. And it's typically, again, a side pick and roll, not a middle pick and roll. That's why David has the middle as a separate category, which is what you think Chris Paul and DeAndre Ayton run a ton. So the empty is going to be starting on one of the wings and running a pick and roll that way. Some of the Suns' signature sets fall into this category. The double drag is the best example. I've broken that play down a ton. All those times when Devin Booker is kicking the ball into the corner to Kevin Durant in the Clippers series, at times in this series, that is often coming on double drag, or at the very least a side pick and roll where Kevin Durant is in the weak side corner on the opposite side of the floor. All right? That type of offense, that empty pick and roll, that one has continued to deliver the best offense for the Suns, basically no matter who is on the court. I shouldn't even actually say basically. Whoever is handling the ball, that has been the best offense. Chris Paul ran that 5 times in Game 2. The Suns scored 7 points out of it. Devin Booker ran it 8 times for 13 points, and Kevin Durant ran it 5 times for 4 points. That's the best. That's the best that it is. I know those point totals sound small, but you think how small we're slicing up these possessions. It's not exactly, nobody's doing anything 50 times in a game. Teams mix it up, especially when you have 3 great ball handlers. This is not the James Harden Rockets where it's like, all right, and they're running a middle pick and roll where they get a switch and take a pull-up 3. Like, that's not what the Suns do. So, you got to find the margins. You got to find the small ways that you're getting advantage on the defense. The number 2 takeaway here is that KD and Book ISOs have not been successful. That passes the eye test, does it not? You don't need a stat for me to tell you that, right? In Game 2, 11 ISOs for Booker, 11 points. 11 ISOs for Durant, 11 points. That's not good enough. And for a little bit more context here, The Nuggets in game 1 had a 136 offensive rating. So that's 1.36 or 1.4 points per possession compared to 1 for those ISOs. In game 2, the Nuggets had a pretty poor offensive rating because it was a rock fight of a game, obviously 97-87. But if you go to the half court, the Nuggets had a 100 offensive rating, which means 1 point per possession. So on everything the Nuggets tried in game 2, they had the same amount of success as the Suns did with something that should be one of their best options, which is an ISO for 2 of the best scorers in the NBA. That's just not going to cut it. Obviously, ISOs tend to have a lower total efficiency in general, but you use them selectively against mismatches in certain moments, late in games, late in the clock, late when you need a bucket to fight against another team's run, whatever the case is, and you take what you can get. But 1 point per possession is not ideal, and especially when you think a lot of those aren't even necessarily misses. Some of those are coming on turnovers and other ugly things that lead to bad outcomes for the Suns on the other end. The last point here, the last takeaway as I look at these numbers is Durant as a ball handler. And this is really bad, all right? 14 possessions last night, Durant ran a middle pick and roll. So again, that's just traditional pick and roll, top of the key, big man sets a screen, or whoever sets a screen, ball handler drives down the middle of the floor, or takes a pull-up 3, or passes it out to a shooter right away, whatever. The pick and roll you're picturing in your head, that's a traditional middle pick and roll, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. Durant ran that 14 times. The Suns made 1 shot out of that. So again, 14 possessions, 2 points. You want to go to points per possession there, that is 0.14. That would be the equivalent of a 14 point per 100 possession offensive rating. That's not ever something that would happen in a game, but that just shows you how ugly and awful that was. And again, you probably don't need a stat from me to tell you that. The empty side pick and rolls that Durant ran were not much better. They were better, but not much. Durant as a ball handler is not working for this team. It just is not working. He had 7 turnovers in game 1. He missed a lot of pull-up jumpers off of the pick and roll in game 2 when Booker started to get tired, and then they both just started jacking jumpers and missing, and I talked about that a lot in the recap show, as the everydayers heard. That's all a problem. If Durant is not effective as an isolation scorer or with the ball in his hands as a pick and roll guy, you start to run out of options. And so let me tell you what I think this all means. When we combine the fact that Chris Paul is now going to be out for a while, not a while, but in the grand scheme of a series, a week is a while, and these things are not working for Durant. And again, what is working is that empty corner pick and roll. And Booker, in particular, has been really effective running that. So, what does it all mean? I think Booker needs to have the ball in his hands. Trust the process here. That's a really important ingredient here. I talked about decisiveness a lot after game 1 in the 2 episodes that we did after game 1. And this is another version of saying that, right? That's another thing that the Suns lose without Chris Paul. Chris Paul, even if something doesn't work, even if it's awkward or uncomfortable or people are making mistakes, he's going to keep running offense. Sometimes to his detriment. I know we've had times where that has been frustrating, but that's a positive quality. That's what you want in a point guard. That's why he is a little bit of a dying breed in that way. But Booker needs to channel that, because if you're talking about, as I said I would do, putting Booker as basically the starting primary ball handler, not putting Payne in this game on Friday, then you need Booker to be playing like a point guard and resisting the urge to go away from the Suns offense and basically not do what he did in game 2 late, which is over-reliance on isolations, over-reliance on jumpers. Obviously, I do think fatigue and tired legs played a role in why he started settling, but oh well, it's basketball. It's the playoffs. You're playing 40-plus minutes because your team needs you to win. I'm not saying that that's not a reason, but it can't really be an excuse unless you want to keep losing games. So that has to be the case. I think this reinforces the need to have shooting in the starting lineup over another ball handler. the Suns need to run offense and space the floor. That seems to be their best recipe to be getting good scoring numbers, not anything else, right? I don't know, when I'm looking at these numbers and telling you all this stuff that it's showing us, I don't really listen to any of that, read any of that, and say pain, So I think that, to me, is another reason why I like Lee or Shamet or even Ross. I don't think that's going to happen, but sure, in the starting lineup. Or even Torrey Craig. I think that's a possibility that maybe we should take seriously, too, to go Booker, Okogie, Craig Durant, Ayton. Either way, people who will take shots and move the ball and run actual offense, not get bogged down. And then, obviously, and most importantly, the Suns desperately need to find a way to get, maybe not most importantly, very importantly, equally important here, the Suns desperately need to find a way to get Kevin Durant comfortable. That may just be as a spot up and transition scorer right now. And okay, that's crazy. Maybe that sounds insane. I have a worry that already the world's most expensive decoy or whatever was kind of getting joked around with when the Suns were winning with KD in the lineup is going to become a little bit of a meme against him in the offseason if this continues. But at least to get him comfortable in these games and maybe save his energy, all this different stuff, I think that might be the game plan from the jump. Because in game one, the Suns were really isoing Durant hard early. He scored almost 20 points, and then he had less in quarters 2 through 4 than he did in the first quarter alone in game one. And then in game two, it didn't really feel like he ever found a specific recipe necessarily that you were like, that was the stretch Durant dominated. He needs to have a stretch Durant dominated. And maybe that is as a shooter, transition scorer, off-ball player early in the game. And then if that goes well and he's in a better rhythm than he has been so far, maybe you put the ball in his hands a little bit in the second half and see what happens, see what works. On the topic of Kevin Durant, there's been a lot of chatter about the Kevin Durant trade being the problem. I've seen it in the 7 words or less game takes that we do on Twitter after games. I have not retweeted those because I don't particularly agree. I'll tell you why in the next segment. But it's not just you guys. I think it's a bigger question. And once again, I'm going to debunk it. I just don't think it's true. We'll talk about it next. First, today's show, guys, brought to you by the Locked On NBA show. Check it out. Getting you what you need every single weekday, all throughout the playoffs. If you're a hoops head and you're catching up and watching the other series, maybe you don't do that during the regular season and you want to get the greatest analysis from a bunch of different angles, 30 minutes a day just like this show, check out Locked On NBA. Alrighty, coming back here, closing out the show, let's talk about the Kevin Durant trade. I saved this big old can of worms for the very end. I wanted to give you the hard stuff, right? Chris Paul's out, the offense is not working, what's going to go well, what can get better. But this matters too, and I know it is a big can of worms, and I want to get some perspective from Aaron and others as the week goes along, but let me give you my 2 cents. Again, I don't buy this argument at all, and I'll tell you why. Let's just review the trade, right? What did the Suns give up? Primarily, Mikal Bridges and draft picks, in my personal opinion. Jay Crowder was not playing. I think that there is some argument to be had that if they could have kept Crowder out of that trade and maybe potentially made a separate Crowder trade along the lines of what the Nets got from Milwaukee when they eventually traded Crowder, maybe that helps. But really, it looks like for Crowder, the market was a bunch of second-round picks. That's what Rui Hachimura went for. That's what Jay Crowder went for. That was what the best teams who had these luxury tax problems were willing to trade. So the Suns don't have a lot of use for 5 second-round picks. I don't think those guys would have helped you beat. I don't think those 5 second-round picks would have taken the floor against Denver. Let me put it that way. I think you get what I'm saying. Cam Johnson, I'm not intentionally not including him. I think he would have made a world of difference, say, if he had stayed on the team. Can you imagine him as the 5th guy? This team would have been, swept the Clippers without a problem and probably won these 2 games in Denver. Like, I don't know how you beat that team with a legitimate killer spot-up shooter in the 5th spot. But the reason I say that in terms of the big picture is the Suns clearly didn't want to pay Cam Johnson, and he's an injury risk. So I think we would have been having a pretty serious conversation about if the Suns had traded him in the offseason anyway. Now, the difference is if he's not in the Durant trade, he's now playing in this year's playoffs, which would have maximized this season more, and you get more assets for him even if you do do a sign and trade with him in the summer. So I guess I shouldn't disregard him completely, but my point in saying that is when we are evaluating the big picture of what the kind of chips that the Suns have to play is, I don't think including the Cam Johnson chip in this trade, if the Nets value him, was all that terrible, because it's something you might have wanted to get rid of anyway. And if you're getting rid of that player in order to get somebody as great as Kevin Durant, you take that 10 times out of 10 over, well, maybe in the summer we can trade him to Cleveland and get Isaac Okoro. Like, okay, not going to be the difference maker, right? So I guess what I'm saying here is Crowder, Johnson, you can make the case that including them in this trade, if that's what it took to get it done, was for the best. Let's talk about the Mikal Bridges part. I do not believe that Mikal Bridges would have become a star on this team, and I think we had about 55 games of evidence of that leading up to the Durant trade. He had his opportunities playing off of Booker, playing off of Paul, playing off of Ayton, being asked to do more. He started to grow. He had games like the Houston game where it was absolutely atrociously ugly. Now, he did not have the greatest supporting cast around him. That was asking a lot. I'm not trying to knock him for that, but I think that guys in their mid to late 20s who have opportunities to operate with the ball in a given context will show you what they are. I think that Mikal Bridges is an absolutely phenomenal number 3 on a title team at this point, the way he looked in Brooklyn. I don't know if he's even proven he can be a number 2, let alone a number 1. I don't think the Suns would have needed him to be a number 1 because they have Booker, but I don't even know if he could be a number 2. It's a very reductive way to talk about this stuff, but what you're talking about with Durant is somebody who absolutely is 1A or 1B on a championship team, no-brainer. And anyone who watched the Suns in the past 2 years knew this was what they needed. Absolutely, unequivocally, 1,000,000%. There's no argument against that. There is no argument against the Suns needing somebody as potent of a scorer as Durant. The fact that they were looking at a John Collins trade should tell you what you need to know about how the Suns felt, about what they had with their offense, even when Bridges was on the court, right? He shot 43% and he got swept by the Philadelphia 76ers this year. And I'm not knocking him. If you're on YouTube, you can see his jersey sitting behind me. I just want people to be realistic. The Suns did not play all their cards in this trade either. I think that's been out there. And this doesn't matter so much for this series, but just to put it in here, right? They did not play all their cards. They did not mortgage the future entirely because they still have the Chris Paul and DeAndre Ayton chips to play. It just has to be this offseason, which is another reason that the Durant trade did hurt, is that it happened in February. And not only did it happen in February, it happened the day of the deadline. There were no more moves to be made, right? That hurt them. That made it so that they didn't get to craft a perfect Durant-Booker roster. They didn't get to evaluate all these other options like they may have if they had gotten it done last July when he originally asked to come to Phoenix. None of that happened. So that's not ideal, but again, this thing is not finished. This roster is not a finished product. Now, with some of those caveats out of the way, especially the Bridges part and especially the package part, really you gave up Bridges and Johnson for Kevin Durant, right? For this year, for what the Suns' ceiling would have been in this deadline or in this playoffs. The real roster issues facing this team are the same as they were before the Durant trade. The same ones we were talking about in November when Chris Paul and Cam Johnson were hurt, in December and January when Booker was hurt. Those are the same problems now. They have not drafted a difference maker since Cam Johnson in 2019. They have had no real player development system the past 2 years while they were chasing wins, playing their guys a lot of minutes, and not having a G League team. They did not use the full MLE in 2022. Remember, they gave half of it to JaVale McGee. They did not use the taxpayer mid-level in 2023. Remember when we were talking 8 months ago about Dennis Schroeder and whether he might want to come to Phoenix and then he eventually goes to the Lakers? That matters. Dennis Schroeder might be the number 1 guy to guard Steph Curry in the first round or in the second round series that those two teams are about to play. Dennis Schroeder made the biggest 3 of the Lakers season potentially in that play-in game on the kick out that LeBron made. Don't you think he would have been nice? Imagine how different we would feel about Chris Paul's injury if Dennis Schroeder played on this team. I don't know if he was ever going to come here. He played for the Lakers before. He had a weird situation where he went to Boston and was not very effective. Now he's back with the Lakers. Maybe that was always what he wanted to do. They were dealing with the Kyrie stuff, and then once that ended and he got back from Eurobasket or EuroLeague, whatever it was, they just said, all right, we're signing him. I'm just giving an example. Even if it wasn't him, the Warriors got Dante DiVincenzo with their tax pyramid level. The Celtics got Danilo Gallinari with theirs. The Suns did not use it. I said that they didn't have time to make any more trades on deadline day, but we know they did. They traded Dario Saric for salary relief. I feel like you guys know that was a frustrating move, but for the wrong reason, because I've still kept hearing from fans who feel like Darius Bazley should be playing. And the argument seems to be, well, if they traded Dario Saric for Darius Bazley, he must be something. Not sure he is. Okay, I hear you. If they traded Dario Saric, you'd think it would have been for something. Well, no, it was for salary relief. And so it's a little bit bizarre and not really a conversation for today that at the same time that Matt Ishbia put all of his chips in the center of the table to go get Durant, he always also wanted to do a tax-cutting move, a salary-cutting move, to get rid of Saric and bring in a guy on a rookie deal that makes a lot less money. Gave up a pick, I believe at least one second-round pick to do that, right? Dario Saric probably would be playing in these playoffs, you know? So that's another reason they don't have a role player. I'm not saying he would be the difference between winning and losing games 1 and 2, but he would be a player. Bazley's not going to crack the court. I can tell you that for sure. I think the last part is a little bit on the coaching. And again, I'm trying to hear you guys and incorporate and not always feel like such a Monty truther, Monty believer, because I do feel like there are faults here. And when I watch the rest of the playoffs, even the first round opponent that the Suns had, I see coaches that are trying to use the entirety, the Heat are a good example, right? The entirety of their rotation, the entirety of their roster, I should say. And Monty does that. We've seen everybody from Terrence Ross to, well, not really Ross, actually, TJ Warren to Ish Wainwright, both centers, get minutes in real competitive game time in these playoffs. But I guess that's the difference between being played and being used, right? Like I give the example of Ty Lue with Covington and Marcus Morris. They don't play the first 2-3 games. Then Kawhi goes down. I think those guys finally played in game 4. But they're used, right? Marcus Morris is getting post touches for better or worse, but look, he is. Covington is, letting it fly from 3, getting 20-plus minutes, switching on to different guys and trying to guard them. He's not playing 3 minutes and then never seeing the court again. That's not really using a player, right? And so I think this extends back even into the regular season. I was sitting here saying Monty needs to just pick 10 guys and settle on a rotation. If it changes come playoff time, so be it. But he went into the playoffs not even knowing who the rotation was going to be, and I'm sure it affects guys' ability to get comfortable, right? What would a version of Terrence Ross, who admittedly his defensive numbers ever since he became a Sun have been atrocious, and he's had really bad moments getting punked by guys like, Middleton, I believe it was, or Holiday in the Bucks game, and Luka, and all the rest. I'm not trying to deny that, but I would think he'd be at least a little bit more comfortable if he knew he was playing. Nuggets fans that's strong. Nuggets fans don't like the Jeff Green minutes. Going into this series, I was seeing a lot of chatter online of Denver should not be playing Jeff Green. He's not going to have a role in this series. He's survived out there, right? I know it hasn't been pretty, but I'm looking at the Game 2 box score, and they outscored the Suns by 7 when he was out there in 16 minutes. That feels like fine to me. He got 2 blocks, had a dunk. That's because Michael Malone said, game 1 of the playoffs, that's our backup big man. Imagine if Monty had said that about any of these guys, right? Even Shamet, it's like that seems to be the one guy he committed to, and that didn't go well. So it's not easy. The Suns don't have the talent off the bench. I'm also the same person who's been telling you that if the Suns had all these great players off the bench, they would be playing them, and the team would be winning. It's exactly the point I just made about Cam Johnson. So there's not a perfect option, but there are at least options. And at the end of the day, you kind of just need to pick one. But these are the reasons that the Suns are where they are in terms of depth, in terms of roster limitations, not because they made some grand mistake with the Kevin Durant trade. I don't think they made a mistake. There's nothing that could really happen outside of a career-ending injury. But even then, and I hate to even put that out there, even then, that's a fluke of all flukes. That wouldn't count as a failure. That would count as the worst luck ever. These aren't, you don't say no to a Kevin Durant trade because you want to keep Jay Crowder to maybe flip for another role player. That's stupid. If you want role players, you draft better. You use every financial resource available to you, and you try to develop your players to be ready for these moments. The Suns have not done any of that stuff consistently enough. That's why they're in the hole that they're in. All right, that'll wrap us up. We have more to come this week as we get ready for Game 3 in Phoenix on Friday. Feels like a lifetime away, but it'll be here before we know it. Everydayers, I'll be back tomorrow trying to get a guest. If not, more analysis on where this series is headed. Maybe some of this big picture stuff too. We shall see. Aaron Edwards will be here Aaron will be here tomorrow. And then Friday, I'll try to get another guest. That'll wrap us up, though. Listen to Locked On NBA wherever you get your podcasts as well. I'll talk to the Everydayers tomorrow. Maybe you can become one too. See you then.